Created by Design, episode 12. This is going to be one of the hottest days in Oregon, and I'm going to be talking to you about wool. I know that seems a little silly, but I have been waiting for some time to do this episode on a couple of my very, very favorite things. And I think it's supposed to get to be 105, 6 maybe today, and hotter tomorrow. So I've decided this was a good inside project today, was to make another episode. And actually I might break this one up into 3 episodes. And I'll get back to the Celtic knots probably in a few more episodes, because I love doing that too. That was on our last episode. But I've been putting this episode together in my mind for some time. I'm doing an Oprah Winfrey, my favorite things. And so this is one of my favorite things. I'm going to talk to you about how I got started into Fair Isle, how I even heard about it. I did not hear about it till about 2018. And I somehow came across a YouTube called Fruity Knitting. Crazy name. There's a story behind it. But the one thing about Fruity Knitting name, you won't forget it, because fruit and knitting don't really go together. But you do remember the name. And I started watching, and it's was a husband and wife, and over in Frankfurt, Germany. And they did such neat episodes. I think they've done like 112 episodes thus far. And he's from Scotland, or not Scotland. He is from Australia. And I think maybe she was too. And interesting story, interesting people. She was an opera singer. And Andrea and Andrew. Sad story is, this last year, not very many months ago, Andrew was diagnosed with a brain tumor and sadly has passed away. But she is beginning to start making more episodes. A very, very talented person. And I love the fact that her husband knitted. He had been something to do with statistics and computers, and a very brilliant man. But I encourage you to look up Fruity Knitting, YouTube. Start out with episode 1. In the very beginning, they obviously didn't have fantastic equipment, and along the way improved their equipment. Every episode, though, I have learned something, and that's where I was introduced to Fair Isle knitting. I had done one project. You see all my sweaters behind me here, and I'm going to do an episode just on them. But this sweater here actually was my first one that I did with any Fair Isle, which is up across the yoke. And I wished I knew then what I know now, because there's many things wrong with that sweater. I love the sweater, but if we're going to pick it apart, there's a lot of things I learned. And so I'm going to do one episode just on my sweaters, and because it's a journey all of its own. But that's where I was introduced, was through Fruity Knitting. And she kept talking about this yarn, Jameson, from the Shetland Islands. And so I began to do a little research on the Shetland Islands, and she would show photographs, and it just resonated with me. And so I have one desire on my bucket list, one of a number, but one of them that I would love to be able to do someday. And I really kind of set it aside because I don't know that it's real practical to get to do, and that would be to go to the Shetland Islands and visit them. I'm not going to 100% rule it out, but I don't see it any time soon in my near future. But one of the people that she talked a lot about was Marie Wallen, and she's a designer and now has her own line of wool. And but one of the first books that I was introduced to, and of course it's called Shetland, and I just have to say there's wonderful patterns in here, some really awesome pictures of the Shetland Islands. There are no trees on the Shetland Islands. It's tundra and turf, and it's what they dug up and burned, but it has a unique grass that not all sheep can even survive on. There is a very, very special breed, Havanese breed, of sheep that survived. And the Shetland Islands have an old history. It's hard for me to even hardly know where to start, but they were a fishing village years ago before they were known for their wool. And the fishing industry thrived there. They sent their fish all over, and that's what kept the little villages going, was the fishing industry. Well, after World War II, big industry came in, big big ships that farmed basically the seas for the fish, and really put the fishermen on those outer islands around Scotland out of business. It was very devastating, hardly a chance really to survive. But they had one other thing going for them, and that was the sheep. And they started, oh my goodness, I'm not even going to try to tell you all the history, but the women started knitting, and there was a huge market in the UK for their knitting, and that's all the sweaters with the big yokes and fancy Fair Isle. We've seen them for years and years. They were made up in Norway also, but the women started knitting, and because they had sheep, and so they expanded the sheep, so the fishermen became curators, I guess, of the wool, you might say, and they started looms, and oh my goodness, that industry took off and is what saved the Shetland Islands. And you think of it, there are no trees on the Shetland Islands. The weather there is severe. You have to be a tough person, I believe, to survive. Even today on the Shetland Islands, it is, they say, not for the faint of heart. Very few months of real summer. Wind is blowing almost all the time. I'll show you this little picture because, of course, this is, I don't know that you can really get a good picture of this, but it's a Shetland pony that runs. At one point in time, they ran completely loose and free on the islands. They've been there for many, many, many years. They think maybe that they were brought in from China by the Nordic. I mean, nobody knows for sure, but a lot of different issues are out there, or stories about how maybe the Shetland horse actually became from the Shetland Islands, but they got their name on the Shetland Islands. And so the Sheltie dog, the Shetland sheepdog from the Shetland Islands. So this is way out in the North Seas, the Shetland Islands. It's a series of islands, some of them very small, and some of them still you can only get to by boat. To get to the Shetland Islands is no easy trek. There is a ferry. It's about I think maybe a 14-hour ferry ride. And a lot of people do it at night, so they get a berth to sleep. And a couple years ago, when we were in the UK, we thought very, very, very seriously about going on to the Shetland Islands. And my husband really, really tried to talk me into it, but were going to be gone for 3 weeks, and I just thought it was more than what we were supposed to do. And I still think that was the right decision, because we got home right before COVID hit, safe and sound, so it was all good. But I still would love to go back and see the Shetland Islands. The history of the wool and the knitting and how it supplied industry even to the UK is an amazing story. Back in that day, there were not the synthetic fibers, so wool was a very, very critical market in the world, not just in the UK, but certainly for the colder countries. And you can see why out there on the Shetland Islands, wool was a way of survival, because the sheep there, first of all, I'll tell you this, the sheep there very special breed. If you took one of our sheep that we have nowadays raised even in the UK, if you took it over there to the Shetland Islands to live and produce wool, it probably wouldn't survive because it needs a whole different kind of nutrition than what is on the Shetland Islands. So that breed of sheep is a very, very unique breed of sheep, and they have 3 different textures of their wool. The long, very, very long hairs on the outer and they use that for rope and all other kind of, rugs and all kinds of things. But back in the day, they used all of those different fibers. They separated the 3 fibers out of a coat off of the sheep when they sheared it, and the very, very finest, the underlying layer, is what they made their underwear out of. And can you imagine wearing knitted undergarments? That was all they had. I mean, we're not talking a country that had cotton, and but it was very, very fine, and so it did not have the same texture as what you think of in a lot of wools today. It was up against the skin, and we're talking a tough breed of people. But the truth about wool, if it's a good wool, after it has been worn a bit, washed a couple of times, it actually softens and doesn't have that itchy texture to it. So sometimes when you make a wool garment, bear with it for a little bit till after you've worn it a bit and maybe washed it again after you've blocked it, and it will begin to soften and not have that initial, what you think of as scratchy. But because it has a texture to it, the stickiness of it, wool is very, very desirable for many, many things because they can felt it and use it for all different kinds of products. So anyhow, that's the Shetland Islands, for many reasons, played a big part in all of our history because of where it was in the North Sea. It was a very desirable location for the Germans to take over, just to have control of the seas. So a lot of history. So if you're a history buff and you've never looked into the Shetland Islands, I encourage you to do it. I find them very, very fascinating. And so the industry on the Shetland Islands to make it survive was really saved by the women and the knitting that they did and perfecting their fiber. And today there is a company called Jameson, and that's a yarn that I use. They also have another brand. It's called Jameson and Smith. It actually is spun and taken care of all in the UK, and that particular yarn is some Shetland yarn, but they also mix in some breeds from the UK. It's still a very, very good yarn. It is compatible with the Jameson, but it is a blend, but no acrylics in it. It's just all wool from the UK, and a lot of nice colors. The Jameson that I'm using from the Shetland Islands, Spindrift, is the weight that I use, and reason why I use it is, I'm going to pick this up and show you. This is their color palette. Huge, huge color palette, and I understand they even have more than this now. Probably, I don't know, maybe they're 200 different shades, and that makes it fun for knitters that are doing Fair Isle. They also have a line, I'll show you this here. These are all natural, undyed, right off of the sheep color. So one sheep can have more than one color fiber, and that also is separated, and that gets separated by hand. I mean, this is a pretty challenging process, but I began to listen to the Fruity Knitting, and they started talking about the Shetland Islands. They had visited them several times, shared pictures. on Fruity Knitting, they have a drone. So they go and do knitting in a number of different locations in the United Kingdom, but Germany, Australia, Austria, oh my goodness, a number of countries over there. And then they also interview knitters and designers from all around the world. So you're not just listening to a knitting program, you're getting a lot of history about knitting, about the countries, about the people. And I've just found it so fascinating. I did not realize that there were so many different ways to knit. Different countries have different knitting styles. And my grandma taught me how to knit, and it's very different from somebody that's learned from the UK, for instance. My grandma was from Sweden. And so if you're interested in history at all, I just encourage you to take a peek at Fruity Knitting and listen to the episodes. Start with episode 1, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. I have loved them. They have talked a lot, for instance, about design and how design in the big fashion world has been used. And I never really thought about that about knitting be on the runway, for instance. Well, it has been and is. And it's a big part of it. And so it has been very, very fascinating to me to really delve in and learn more about knitting, wool particularly. Recently, I read a book, I'll post the name of it, about knitting and yarn here in the United States. And at one time, wool was a thriving industry, raising sheep for their wool. And now it's less than 1% of our, gross whatever product that we produce in the United States. Very, very shocking. And of course, that's all gone to China. So that's another whole big story. But the wool was the survivor of the Shetland Islands. And now, believe it or not, they are thriving again because of the oil industry and the oil wells in the North Seas. So it has brought industry into the Shetland Islands, which has been another piece of the lifesaver. But one of the things that the knitting had almost kind of not really died away, but definitely wasn't as the demand for it from the Shetland Islands kind of diminished in the last number of years, and tourism became a big industry for them. And somebody had a brainstorm, some knitter, of course, a knitter, to do a week of wool and knitting. And so it's called Wool Week, and I think it is in maybe September, October. Would love to go to it. It's a week-long convention of knitters from around the world, and they get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people coming from all around the world for this 1 week, Wool Week. And you get to do tours, and they take you through the process of separating the wool, to the weaving of the wool, to the spinning for the yarn. And it has brought great industry back into the Shetland Islands. Well, with COVID, it just came to a screeching halt, and you couldn't even fly, you couldn't get to the Shetland Islands. And I think now it's opened up, but I think that's been just recently, if they are open for tourism. But somebody had a wonderful idea that since Wool Week couldn't happen, they would make a yearly journal. And so I got my hands on volume 1, which came out last year, 2000, and they call it a journal. But in here is all kinds of history, recipes from the Shetland Islands, patterns, a lot of information about Fair Isle knitting. Fair Isle meaning no more than 2 colors per row. Some rows only have one color, but no more than 2 colors. Some wonderful designs that were created specially for this book. See if I can get a picture that will show up here. They're a little bit dark. Well, this is not the colors this is made in, but similar, and just nice colors, patterns to follow. Easy for a beginner Fair Isle knitter. In volume 2, there are a lot more pictures, a lot more history. Now artists have moved into the area and they're using these 2 years worth of journals as a way to supplement the knitting industry that's there, because they couldn't even manufacture some of the wool this last year because of COVID. Certainly has cut down or cut out all of their tourism. And so they came up with this wonderful idea to make these journals, but they're so worth the money. I think maybe I paid, I'm looking here on the back to see, I don't know, it was probably close to $20, but very worth every penny that I paid for these journals. In this particular journal, there is a sweater here. I don't know that you can see it. It's really a little pull-over vest with a drop shoulder, a little lace at the bottom, and it's made out of wool. And I'm considering it to be one of my next projects, or at least soon in the future, but would maybe make a vest out of it with a little drop shoulder. And I think it would be really cute. One of the things that it's just a single layer. When you knit Fair Isle, you're really getting 2 layers of wool, because you're carrying a yarn across the back that is the color, the second color that you're working with, and then you've got your front layer. So it really does become quite a heavy garment, substantial for that kind of weather. Not particularly conducive to our weather nowadays, because it's just not as cold in the winter times as it used to be. Unless you're up skiing, then it's perfect. But that's why a lot of people just do a yoke out of the Fair Isle, and then the rest of the body is just a single layer knitting. One of the things that I have learned that I have found very fascinating, that I did not have any clue of how important wool has been to fabrics all over the world. And plastics came in to being back in the 50s, and how ultimately now we're fighting with having too much plastic and too much plastic in the soil, and that's finding its way into our food system. So there is a big push now to find out how more wool and other natural fibers can be introduced into our garments, rather than expanding on acrylics, which is plastic. And it has affected all of us, and it's not something any of us probably sit and think about, but it is a big deal. And the diminishing of wool production in the United States has been a big hit on our economy. We haven't noticed it or seen it, or we don't think we've seen it, but so many jobs have gone to China because of it. We don't raise the amount of sheep that we used to. There's really only one place in the United States that even processes wool, and there used to be many, many, many places. So wool coming back into existence is a very, very interesting thing to learn and read about, and I only know just enough to get into trouble to talk about it. But that's part of what is discussed in these books, and how it has affected the Shetland Islands, and really how important the Shetland Islands were to all of us. We didn't know it. They're just some little islands out there in the North Seas. Fortunately, nowadays, oil has come back into being a big production for them, where fishing died off, and then the sheep raising of the wool, the fleeces, became a big part. Now many jobs have been created through the big oil wells out in the North Sea. When we were on our last cruise up in that area, we were so amazed to see the amount of oil wells in the North Sea. It was quite amazing. And just, we don't see that around our northwest coast. So it's kind of something unique to see. I'm sure there's a lot of opinions about that, but nevertheless, it's here, and it's what has brought some industry back into the Shetland Islands. But tourism being down, these journals were created, which I think is a very novel way to bring in money into their economy, because during the Shetland Wool Week, hundreds and hundreds of knitters from around the world did come and spend a week. They had tours and did lots of knitting classes, had well-known designers in knitting from all around the world to come. I would love to go do that. Maybe someday, who knows? But it brought a lot of money into the local economy, as you can imagine. And so they hope to start it back up, maybe, not this year for sure, but maybe 2022. And that will bring a lot of visitors back to their beautiful islands. There's many, many places to hike. So for people that are really want to be out and do a lot of hiking, I guess there's beautiful areas to go to, very scenic. In fact, a lot of artists have come into the area now, and it's very unique. The colors that they work with a lot in their yarn is based upon their own natural color scenery. So they have lots of blues and grays and lavenders, a few pinks, some reds, deep colors, jewel tones. You will see a lot in their knitting colors. I'll show more pictures of their yarn colors at the end of this video. So besides Marie Wallin, she has greatly influenced my Fair Isle knitting. She has done some beautiful, beautiful designs. The pictures in this book are kind of dark, hard to see, but I'll see if this one will reproduce. This is just one of the pullovers that she has made. Love her designs. These are all her own creations. And this is out of the book Shetland. Just a lot of inspiration. Have to show you this picture of the Shetland ponies. She said while she was there doing this photo shoot, these little wild horses came into their scene unintentional, so they added them to their book, which I think is pretty terrific. We used to raise miniature horses back a few years ago, and all miniature horses have some Shetland blood in them. They've certainly been refined down to the show horse that we have today, but the Shetland bloodline is at the base of, I would dare say, all miniature horses. And they're a hardy little horse. Here's a really, really cute hat that Marie Wallin has made. Haven't made that, but I think it's pretty cute. Someone else that really influenced my work is Alice Starmore. And I have a sweater here that's hers design right here. I love the colors. As I've aged, I decided I can put all kinds of colors together, and I love color. So what I didn't know when I chose this pattern, and after I purchased it, I researched it a bit to find out that Alice Starmore, who lives in the UK, made her a first trip to Oregon. And this design actually is called Oregon, and it's from inspiration that she got here. She fell in love with Oregon. And so she's got the leaves here, there's trees, and the colors in here are colors that she saw. I guess it was in the fall time of the year. And I just thought that was kind of funny. I didn't know that when I fell in love with the pattern myself. But Alice Starmore has been a great influence to me, and she has written a number of pattern books and has a couple of books out that are just nothing but designs that she has developed. And I loved going through that book and getting ideas, and I take them and incorporate them in the work that I do. So there's been a number of people that have influenced my Fair Isle knitting since 2018. But I have to thank Fruity Knitting for really expanding my knowledge and introduced me to Jameson yarn, the Shetland Islands, and I've learned so much more from watching their videos. I would just really encourage you to spend some time and watch them, even if you're not a knitter, because they, like I said before, have taken videos from all around the world, have talked to so many professional designers of knitwear, and I've just learned so much and expanded my appreciation for wool. And like I said earlier, we now as a nation are looking to find ways to incorporate more wool in our garments and try to use less acrylic, just for the health of our land. And wool does not have to be really hot. They can now make it in such a fine fiber, and blending it with silk, flax, even cotton, they're finding ways to make it be even more usable, not as hot as what we get when we knit in Fair Isle, but it's just really interesting to see what is happening to the fiber industry now that everybody's becoming more aware of what's happening with plastics and not getting consumed properly in Mother Earth. And so I hope this is kind of an inspiration to you to research a little further, expand your knowledge, maybe get excited about Fair Isle knitting. You don't have to knit big sweaters. I'm doing most of my Fair Isle now into the chickens that I'm making, and I'm having a lot of fun with that. And I'm going to do an episode real soon, I think, just on chickens again, because I've begun to really modify the pattern and come up with some different looks, and I enjoy doing that. So have a really safe weekend and try to stay cool. It's really hot outside right now. I think we're at 103, 104 maybe, and so I'm not venturing outside. But be safe, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye now.